Welcome to tonight's Medkind lecture. Thank you very much for coming. There are dishes in the foyer for anyone who would like to make a donation to our charity, which is, of course, Maggie's. Afterwards, we're going to have a cheese and wine reception in Maggie's so that you can have a look around the building and see how beautiful it is on the inside as it is on the outside. The next meeting is on March the 11th, and this is when Professor Steve Jones is going to give his talk, Incest and Folk Dancing, Two Things to Avoid. Anyway, on to our speaker, Piers Gough. Piers, of course, is architect of our beautiful Maggie's. When I lived in London in the second half of the 1980s, there were two things that particularly excited me about living in London then. One was the booming cabaret circuit, where we used to go to the Banana Cabaret and see people like the Joan Collins Fan Club and Fanny the Wonder Dog. And that was, of course, Julian Clary before he became famous. And the other one who was virtually an open microphone spot at the Banana Cabaret was the Sea Monster, and she is now Jo Brand. The other really exciting thing going on in London at the time was the huge development of Docklands with some truly inspirational architecture. And it is the work on London's Docklands that Piers Gough has really made his name. Piers is a founding member of the, founding partner of the architect group CZWG. The G, of course, stands for Gough. Notable buildings they have made include the Cascades Apartment Tower on the Isle of Dogs, Janet Street Porter's House, and the Westbourne Grove Public Lavatories. I suspected people might laugh at that, but can I recommend that you have a look at the CZWG website? The buildings there are absolutely superb. I was intrigued to see what the Westbourne Grove Public Lavatories look like, and they are actually very beautiful, it's a deco-style building, really lovely. Piers was awarded CBE in 1988 for services to architecture, and he was elected a Royal Academician in 2002. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Piers Gough, who is going to speak to us tonight on Maggie's and other amazing Maggie centres. Thank you.
Thank you. I was at Architecture College in London in the 60s, and we'd never had it so good. And, of course, we got free education, and now we're being made to feel guilty about it. But I was at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, the biggest school of architecture in Britain, and the 60s was a very, very magical time to be an architect or an aspiring architect because everything seemed possible. Pop art had just burst onto the art scene, bright colours, a lot of fun, popular imagery, these kinds of things, which transformed, we determined would transform architecture from being all rough-shuttered concrete and kind of seriousness of the post-war years. The post-war years in architecture were very socially minded, very much building a new Britain, and in that way, a completely respectable and marvellous thing to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the buildings were disliked by the public quite considerably because they were just too worthy, too good, too concretey and too grey. And this we saw as a marvellous opportunity to transform. One of my lecturers at the Architectural Association was Charles Jenks. Charles Jenks was an American, very feisty architecture historian who used to come and turn us on to the incredible things that were happening all over the world in architecture and give us the kind of rationale or his belief of what the rationale was, which was always fairly much off the wall, very much a sort of idiosyncratic view of the history of architecture. But he could never be argued with because Charles had toured the world and had seen all these buildings he described. Unlike most people who relied on pictures and slides of their work, of the work of other architects, he'd not only visited the works, God, he'd visited the architects and chatted to them and talked to them and written books about them. So he was incredibly knowledgeable and very, very, very enthusiastic about the possibilities of architecture, particularly spiritually and in ways that architects didn't at that time think about, which was the sort of poetry, the cosmology of architecture, if you like. Anyway, he while he was still teaching at the AA, he fell in love with a most wonderful woman called Maggie Keswick, who was the scion of a big Hong family from Hong Kong. The Keswicks are still, I think, connected with Johnson Matthey, and who are a very big Hong Kong family. So Charlie and Maggie got together, and they took a house in Holland Park, and just after I graduated, they gave me a little job, which I was extremely grateful for, since I've never worked for another architect. I couldn't bear to go into an office with anyone else, so I've always been out on my own with my partners, doing our own thing, and so they gave me this little gem to do, which was their jacuzzi. I got to do the jacuzzi in their house, and because Charlie was a historian, we decided to make the jacuzzi an upside-down dome. And so we round at his house, we got his phenomenal collection of photographs of domes and turned them upside down in the slide projector, and thought, well, now, would that make a good, Brunelleschi? Does he make a good jacuzzi? Or really, would Borromini be better? I mean, really, we were that mad. And the good thing about a dome is, if it's got a cupola, you can put your feet in the cupola and sit on the dome. It does work, actually, quite well as a jacuzzi. Anyway, we did that. We built it in their house, and they were really fabulous about it and very, very funny and good fun to work with. And Maggie was just rolled her eyes, just like these mad boys and their crazy ideas. But she was always a very, very supportive, and by that time they had a family and a lovely family full of joy. Anyway, as you will gather, of course, Maggie got cancer. They lived had an estate in Perthshire, and so she went to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary for her cancer diagnosis. And there she met one of the cancer nurses called Laura Lee. And together they became friends, and then they thought, there has to be a better way than sitting in this ghastly plastic-lined corridor on plastic chairs talking about the most terrible news of your life. That can't really be all there is to the way in which medicine can be administered. Surely there must be some way that people with this quite often surprised and devastating news could accommodate it in a more sympathetic surroundings. Now, neither of them have ever spoken out against the NHS, because, of course, they provide all the skills, medical skills and ability and fantastic research that helps cancer sufferers live longer. Nobody doubts that or questions that. That's not really the thing. The thing is the relationship with your doctor is by necessity, because of the incredible pressure on the NHS, limited to a certain amount of time. And famously, of course, as I think we all know, and this may be too glib, everything that you hear goes in one ear and out the other, because you are so devastated you don't hear anything of what's being said to you, particularly at the first meeting. And so you need somewhere where you can unwind all that and maybe just have a respite from discovering that, or want to talk about it more in a more leisurely way, in a longer time of assimilation, or frankly have a bloody good cry. But unfortunately the loos are all occupied. so you can't even get in there. And then they're flimsy, so you're too embarrassed to really cry. So Maggie and Laura conceived of this idea that they would start a place, a day place, not a hostel or a respite hospital, but just a place where you could go and talk about your illness and discover people who could help you, mostly other people, other sufferers, of course, who would give you their take and their understanding, and probably maybe further down the line, their understanding of the disease. Also, you could learn and read and have a good library and come to terms with this desperate disease in surroundings which were as sympathetic as possible. And this would help not only the patient, but of course their families. And because, as I think, families suffer as much as the patient, but have even somehow less control. So Maggie centres were invented by Maggie and Laura, and they persuaded the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary to give them a building, an old stable block, in the grounds of the hospital that they could convert into a Maggie's centre as an experiment. And right away they went to one of the very leading architects in Edinburgh at the time, Richard Murphy, very bright, very young, incredibly enthusiastic, talkative, fun, in fact rather outrageous architect, who wasn't perhaps the most mainstream architect in Edinburgh by a very long way. In fact, he was probably the maverick of Edinburgh architecture, and they immediately, being Charlie, being very, very taken with architecture, with the importance of architecture, they sort of got the ball rolling with one of the most interesting young architects of his generation in Edinburgh. And they converted a stables in a very free and happy way and made it very domestic. Maggie and Laura came up with this rule: no corridors, no plastic. It's got to be more like a home from home, but hopefully a rather marvellous architectural building as well as a home. So it wouldn't be quite like your own home. It would be something rather special and glorious, and something of a celebration of the possibilities of architecture, using colour and soft materials and so on. Now, of course, Maggie's doesn't have to have a level of hygiene that an ordinary hospital has to achieve. It has got lots of freedoms that hospitals don't have, and it's usually set away from the hospital, not joined up to it. So it's separate. It's on the campus, though, however. I think that's an important point about Maggie's, is they're not somewhere else in the city. They are very much part of the hospital. And so that the people who who work in the hospital can know of Maggie's in a very direct way, can have a direct relationship with it, and can recommend it wholeheartedly from having seen it and been it and met the people who run it. The stables was a particularly good choice. It had a couple of levels in it. It was quite compact, and it was based around something which Maggie's has stuck with right from that very first one, which is the kitchen. The idea that it's a very English thing, but you start with a cup of tea. It's the sort of breaks the ice. You come in the door and there's a kitchen, and then you can kind of gravitate towards that or other people, and they sort of set the scene quite early on for how it was done. Laura describes her experience like this. She says, "I was a nurse in a hospital. I wore the uniform, and that may be part of it, but I would talk to the patients and they would tell me things. And a week later, I was in the Maggie Centre running it. And the very same people came over to the Maggie Centre and they talked in a completely different way to me. They opened up in a way that they never did in the hospital environment. Perhaps because it was the way I was dressed, or perhaps it was because it was in the building I was in. But she's always been an incredible proselytizer for the architecture and the style of the building being part of, maybe a very small part of, compared with the people you meet. But she said she was the same Laura. She claims this is a sort of blind test. She was the same Laura, but they said entirely much more open things to her when she was in a Maggie Centre than when she was in a hospital. And so she says that architecture is a cue, or design is a cue to how you're supposed to behave. And if you design an environment which carries, it's bound to carry messages. Environments carry messages. And so you might wonder to yourself, what message does the hospital environment actually carry? Because it's full of great people doing fantastic things, but is the building great? Is it carrying the same message? Is it telling your loved ones when they come to visit you in your hospital bed, yes, you're in the best possible place? Is that what the architecture's saying? It's a good question. Subsequently, Maggie's were asked to commission by various other hospitals, particularly in Scotland to start with, new Maggie Centres, not just in old stables, but new build Maggie Centres. And they went about collecting money and making sure that they had donors before they built Maggie Centres. They have to collect about 2.5 times the cost of the building to make sure that they can run it for the first 2 years or so, be absolutely sure they can keep it open and run it. So they have to raise rather a lot of money in the first instance to open a Maggie Centre. And one of them, a great one, is in Dundee, where they employed Frank Geary, the architect of Bilbao, to do a Maggie Centre. And Frank knew Maggie. He also knew Maggie really well. They had a house in California. Frank knew them well from that. Well, he knew them well because Charlie was such a fan of Frank's architecture, wrote so brilliantly about it that they had to be friends, really. And I haven't mentioned Maggie died. She died before even the first one opened. But her zest, her kind of enthusiasm for this idea was so infectious that it's carried everyone through the following 15 years or so. Frank did some elaborate design, and then he claims to have had a dream where Maggie told him, simplify it, make it more ordinary. But Frank can't be ordinary. So his Maggie Centre is this delightful little charming, rippling roofed building. It's almost single story, except it's got a sort of one little upstairs space with a fireplace in it. Inside it's very warm, it's full of wood. It's very cozy. As an architect, he's not a cool modernist. He's a much more emotional designer. And I think his work looks like it. He uses curves, he uses sympathetic materials, some quite cheap materials like quite cheap plywood and so on. He designed these rather beautiful chairs which he gave them. This one's made of cardboard and the other ones are made of very thin plywood. They're very comfortable, delicious chairs and very much collector's items, of course. This is his Maggie's. It's not pretentious. It's sweet, actually. It's charming, and even though it's by a great architect. Our own Zaha Hadid did the one in Fife. It was opened by George and Sarah Brown, who both came to the opening of that one. Sarah being a great patron of Maggie's. Zaha's, of course, far more... this is sort of early Zaha, very angular. and cheap. This was built really economically. It's covered in a kind of mineral felt. It's not a very expensive building, but it is a very grand building and a very exciting building. And I think Zaha sort of took the sort of domestic idea of Maggie's and said, well, actually, does it have to be that domestic? Can't it actually just be kind of thrilling? Can we show people an architecture they would very seldom meet in any other walks of their lives, would be nothing like where they lived? And her Maggie's is kind of almost constructivist in its intensity. It has a bower down to the left there. There's a lovely bower of trees which it celebrates looking at. In fact, it's actually in a car park. Effectively, there really was very little land, and so she sort of perched her building on the edge of one sort of dip in the land to get the view. The photographs of it are quite stark. One feels that they are the ones taken by her before it was inhabited too much. They now put down Turkish carpets, and there's been a bit of a sort of rumble about it, you know. They have made it much more soft, I think is the right way of describing it. While we were opening the one in Nottingham, there was a very exciting one in southwest Wales, very yin-yang, Kisha Kurokawa, Japanese, bring a whole other sensibility to it. Also using, well, in this case, concrete, not such a cheap building, but with these very spiritual shapes. And this is very much Charlie's love, is architectural forms, telling you about cosmos and about social relationships, and trying to speak about the world we live in and understand its sort of DNA. And this building is very much like that. By that time, a hearth was usually introduced into a Maggie's, a stove or something. The kitchen, as you can see, is still very, very much an important thing, very central. But after Zaha and with this building, the place has become much more open plan. They're much more like a sort of continuous modernist space with pockets and enclaves off that space. You may have heard of Rem Koolhaas, who's the sort of grand thinker of sort of very late modern architecture, who's a much more cool, much colder character, you could say, very Dutch, very kind of just tall, and he has very strong ideas, which are quite, again, undomestic. But he arranged a Maggie's around a central courtyard, so you have an internal garden, and then, in fact, the outer part of it was also beautifully managed garden. This strange one is in the middle of a naval hospital, but in a bit where the old building has not been restored. So there's this sort of crumbling old hospital with this sort of brand new Maggie's in the middle, like some sort of jagged gem. This building is even more open and is, in my view, veering towards a kind of something not hugely easy to occupy immediately by an average person arriving. Might find it a little daunting. Actually, it's quite strong, very simple kind of modern architecture. But I think what the point is that Maggie's are evolving and discovering that people are excited about buildings that they wouldn't perhaps normally get to enjoy. The landscape here is designed by Lily Jenks, who's Charles and Maggie's daughter, who's a great landscape architect. And so she's started to do a number of the Maggie Centre gardens, which are, but she's obviously particularly good at, and particularly lovely gardens. Coming on to the Nottingham one, I'm afraid you got a less famous architect. and you can blame Frank Geary because I'm quite a pal of his. And we were having dinner one night with Charlie and Laura and Marcia Blakenham, who's one of the trustees. And Frank goes, "Oh, you should have Piers do one." And they all went, yeah, okay, yeah. And then they kind of felt a bit bad about, not doing it. So that's how you came to have me. Frank Geary's suggestion. Piers, you get Piers. Oh, yeah, okay. Right. Anyway, I had the great pleasure to come and choose the site for the Maggies. Sometimes the site's already been chosen before the architect turns up. Here, there was a suggestion that we use that magnificent church or chapel, which is just up the hill from the Maggies. It is a fantastic building, and but we went inside, and it was no way was it ever not going to be a church. We could have done everything, and you would still have gone in there and go, it's a church. It would be very, very, very hard to give it any sort of domestic charm whatsoever. I still think it would make a great restaurant or something, but as a Maggie Centre, it seemed there was glazed brown bricks up to about halfway up the walls. It was really kind of a bit daunting. So we elected to do a new building. And the site we picked was one that we felt could never be of any use to the hospital because it's sloping, it was tree-lined. You wouldn't really want to chop the trees down. And a sloping site is not very favoured by hospital buildings, and it's anyway a tiny site. So we thought that it would be better to do a Maggie Centre that didn't, steal land from the hospital, wasn't really taking anywhere that anybody would have thought of building otherwise. And also we have the slight excuse of chucking out a few cars off the site there and making it a nicer environment in that little bit. It was also extremely close to oncology and the breast unit, and therefore that seemed to be a very, very apposite place to put the Maggies, of the sort of the most obvious place, if you like. And what was nice about it was it had these fully mature trees which we could be inside. So we could use the trees as our landscape. The landscape was kind of already there, and the view out of the building was almost like a given. And we would be both sort of half hidden, but also rather obviously by the south gate, so that, Maggies aren't so self-effacing. They don't like to be seen. They want people to know they're there. And anyway, if you're going to do a lovely building, then it's not bad to put it in a prominent position. So we got this rather strange shaped site, most of which was a parking space, and placed a building on it. I had this idea that it should float above the landscape. It should sort of sit like a tree house, not in the tree, but amongst the trees. Happily for us, the major mature trees were in a bit of a circle, leaving a gap in the middle, which nobody minded that we took a few younger trees down, and then rearranged it so that we had landscape and we had a bridge into it. For the first time, I gave Maggie's a basement because of the storage issues with Maggie's. All the Maggies always suffer from having no storage. Architects famously, as you know, never put enough storage into buildings. So I used my idea to have storage, lifted the building up, which was kind of convenient of it, and so I could make a building that was floating above the ground, using this storage idea as sort of an excuse. And indeed, I think probably that room, probably we shouldn't go and look at it this evening, but I bet it's full of stuff. I bet it is. This Maggie Centre is, we were aware that it was going to be quite a stiff ask to get the money for a Maggie Centre, because they're not, in Scotland they're already kind of famous. but in Nottingham nobody really had heard of one or was anywhere near one, and therefore there was going to be a bit of a learning curve. And although we got the magnificent Nottingham Post on board right from day one, I mean, they wrote a story about Maggie's every week from the time it was announced to the time it opened. They found an excuse to do a Maggie story, fun runs or other collections. They were fantastic, but even so, it was quite a long time to raise enough money to open the Maggies. And I was kind of determined to build a relatively economic one rather than an extravagant one. And it's in fact the plan form is an exact square. It's on 2 floors, which is saves on foundations and so on. I mean, it was quite a thought-out economic strategy, but I didn't want it to look like it was cheap. That would have been counterproductive. But I did want it to be fairly easy to put up. And this Maggie's has a more complex, slightly more discrete areas within it. It has a kitchen that's definitely a room, and it has other sitting rooms that are definitely rooms where you can go and be by yourself or with one other person or with 2 other people. You can have small meetings, you can have large meetings, you can have kitchen that. But some of the Maggies are much more open plan, and you're more on show, if you like. You're more exposed, perhaps. It's more difficult to be private, and I was. Felt an obligation, as much as I'm an architect and love open plan, I felt that I should do something slightly more subtle where the spaces have relationships to each other but can feel more private. And that's why this Maggie's is a little bit, you might say, stiffer in plan. It's a little bit more conventional, actually, than other Maggie's. What it has is the idea is that you come in here off this bridge across to it, which takes you into the sort of magic kingdom of a separate building with its own identity, and then you arrive in a hall, and there's the office is here, so you might catch somebody's eye who works there and say hi, or they might catch your eye, or you could go into the library and just sink into a chair, or you can join a group down here, and you've got sort of choices at that point. This is down a staircase, so you can sort of see the kitchen, but you're not immediately in it. You're not obliged to go to see those people. You could sneak off over here and do something else. You know, it's not an obligation. And then there are sitting rooms here and here, either side of the central kitchen, and they're at a higher level, so the kitchen's lower down and has its own balcony, which is as wide and big as the kitchen, which you can go out onto amongst the trees. And then there's a balcony off the library and this sitting room as well, so you can go and sit on that balcony, or indeed, if you're working there, you can go onto yet another balcony, which is a little more visible, actually, because it's on the road up the hill. And then the upper floor has the largest room, which is a meeting room, and takes sort of, I think it's 14 yoga mats it's supposed to take. And then there are little consultation rooms off that. And one of the great things is a gorgeous lavatory. You know, when you go in the loo, there's a lovely view, and you can go in and stay in there. You can, so that's why there's more than one, because there might be somebody who's going to stay in there sometime and have a jolly, jolly good cry. And so we've tried to provide some nice lavatories, nice big ones, and a few of them, so that they're available. There's a landing which is a sort of for IT and study, and that really sums up this Maggie's. It does have a lift, because once you're over one floor, of course, you have to have a lift. And that makes it slightly unusual in Maggie centres. They tend to be all on one level. And so this is a slightly different Maggie centre from that point of view. That's a nice drawing of the roof. We were talking earlier in the canteen about computer drawings. This is probably the last planning application from my firm that ever be put in hand-drawn, because I just determined to draw this building myself, and I can't draw on a computer. So I have the privilege of other people doing all my drawings for me, except this, because I really wanted it to be a building that I'd drawn, not just thought of. And so the Nottingham Council were rather surprised to receive a set of hand-drawn drawings of the building in the trees. Now, this is where Paul Smith comes in. The magnificent Paul Smith, of course, adores Nottingham, is the great, fabulous designer, Sir Paul Smith. We wear his clothes, don't we? Of course we do, because we're from Nottingham. And he was asked by Maggie's, would he like to work on Maggie's, and they asked me if that was all right. And of course, I absolutely thought that was the best thing that could possibly happen, because he has such a wit and such a style in his interior work, and it would only reflect glory on me, because he would choose furnishings and so on, which would be extremely not just attractive, but very good for conversation, which is a sort of Maggie thing. How do you break the ice at Maggie's? Well, you talk about how could Paul Smith possibly choose such a ridiculous check for an armchair. And so he brilliantly was supposed to dig the first turf with a silver spade, and he said, forget it, get a JCB. And of course the publicity angle of it, him in a JCB just was like this, it was in the national press rather than just the local press. The building itself is like a sort of either a 1950s caravan or a pumpkin that won't go orange, or I don't know. Anyway, it's a funny building with ears, which the intersection of the two oval shapes. It's sort of knew that Canadian log cabins existed. It's like when somebody came back and described a hippopotamus for the first time, and then Dürer drew it all a bit weird because it was from a description. This is almost as if somebody told me how a Canadian log cabin worked, but I didn't realize it had to be made of logs and made it of tiles instead. It has it's quirky and quite fun, but it has very conventional windows or fairly conventional windows and this bright green tile colour, which is very much a Maggie signature colour of the Maggie group, as it were. That green is one that they've sort of established as their green. So I decided to use their green on a tile on the outside. The entranceway is, I think, enticing, and we put a big bench outside, and that's become quite a lunchtime kind of enjoyment for people who work on the campus. It's quite a nice bench facing south. The library space, which is just off the entrance, has books for about and around cancer, and it has a gorgeous Paul Smith quirky furniture. As I say, the kitchen opens straight out onto a balcony with the full width, same width as the kitchen, so it's very easy in and out space. We celebrated a lot Maggie's. It's got a cookie shape. It's a bit like a soup tureen, so I decided to have it made in ceramic. Maggie's wanted to commission one model for an exhibition, and I worked out they could get 6 ceramic models for the same amount of money. So we made 6, and we gave one to Judy Naki, who raised helped raise all the funds for the Nottingham Maggies, and we put some in exhibitions, and I've got one, and Maggie's got one. It's one of those. It's very nice that we sort of got more than we expected out of the budget. Really, this should be called Maggie's Nottingham and all the ones you didn't get. If only by chance you'd had Snøhetta, you would have got this gorgeous shape, which is a true 3-dimensional form with a sort of concrete carapace with these lovely wooden and glass blocks inside. There's also has levels, but is more architectural, more open plan, more cool. And Richard Rogers, who's the famous great Lord Rogers, he did the Maggies in London, near his office at the Charing Cross Hospital, in a corner of their grounds. They didn't have much grounds, actually, that wasn't building, but they found a corner and they did a delicious landscape to walk through to get to it, and an excluding wall around it to keep the city out and to make a private place within. His one is planned round a central courtyard. Again, you can see the inside-outside eating kitchen thing, which is such a strong Maggie idea. He also has a first floor, but it's not. It's much more minor in the plan of things, his first floor, and I don't think he has a lift. But being Richard Rogers, has very bright colours, very strong kind of primary colours is a sort of Richard Rogers signature, floors and walls and so on. And this is a very lovely building. It won the Sterling Prize for the best building of the year in British architecture. They've gone on a pace and they're building lots of Maggies now in Scotland. Riachan Hall, probably unheard of to you, most likely, but they are the most fabulously elegant architects, and they build a lot of hospital buildings. It's really a good idea to look up Riachan Hall. On their website, they do laboratory buildings for hospitals and so on, which are so ravishingly beautiful. They are absolutely fantastic architects. I'd recommend them to anyone who was thinking of building a big institutional building. They've got a grace which most architects can't even begin to achieve. Here, this one, they built a walled garden with a perforated wall. Very lovely interior, quite simple, but very beautiful. Again, with an internal courtyard and a lovely kitchen and a very sort of cool white look, which no doubt, as it gets more furnished and is full of people, would be more colourful and lovely. The other one that's just recently opened is at Oxford. It's by Wilkinson Eyre, Chris Wilkinson, and his one is one that is the design closest to the one I think I flirted with doing in Nottingham. If I hadn't done a two-storey building and done a more open plan, kind of single-storey one, I think it possibly might have been a bit like this, a plane sort of floating above the ground on legs with the landscape kind of flowing underneath it. His one is by a stream. It's a very nice site on quite an ugly hospital campus, an awful lot of car parking, but you just cross the car parking and you're in this bower, this delicious bower. And he's done a very angular scheme, perhaps, again, not very domestic, or rather only what an architect would think was domestic, rather than perhaps an ordinary visitor. It's got glass floor, it's got all kinds of jolly features to talk about. It has a stove and a triangular main table. One of the charms of Maggie's is that after you've designed the whole building, they call you up a few months later and say, would you like to do the kitchen table as a special commission? So I got to do the Maggie's kitchen table that you will see later with its sort of huge fat legs. Now, this sort of Maggie series, and there are some 20 Maggies now, including ones to be in Barcelona and one in Hong Kong, also designed by Frank Gehry, are celebrated in a book called The Architecture of Hope, written by Charles Jenks and Edwin Heathcote. There's just a new edition's just come out, I think, or is about to come out more or less this week. And it's a jolly good read because Charles muses on the difference between hope and fear, and are they the two sides of the same coin? And he writes a very brilliant essay about that consideration. Edwin covers the whole world of hospital history, and where did hospitals come from, and what were the first hospitals like, and how have they developed, and when was it they stopped being graceful, to be crude about it? When did they stop being magnificent, beautiful buildings? When did they start to become machines to cure you, as it were? And that's well worth looking at as well. I think it's a very good book. I was half tempted to kind of précis the book for you, but I think that's just all entirely wrong. I should only really speak from my own experience, and the book can speak for itself, and you obviously have the opportunity to look at it if you want to. But I think it is a very thoughtful book, because Charles has been challenged a lot by the profession, by your profession and by others, about Maggies. They're just a little bauble. They're nothing, And do they make any difference, really? Do they really help? And this sort of challenge. And really, what does architecture do? Does it do anything? Does it really make any difference? And he sort of says, yeah, okay, obviously a hospital has such much bigger constraints. A big hospital, big teaching hospital, is incredibly complex, unbelievably different to a little charming little offspring building. But equally, I think everyone should be thinking about the role of architecture and whether it can have a bigger role and whether it can be allowed to enter the health system, as it were, and be part of the cure and not just a sort of another pair of tweezers, as it were. Because he thinks that one's emotion towards... I think it's famous that if you have a good view, for some reason, if you can see a tree out of the window of your ward, you leave sooner. And that's quite an interesting thing, because you'd think if it was more attractive, you would stay there longer. You'd think, I don't think I'll go home. It's too nice here. But it does seem to be part of the cure. And maybe it's the tree that does it, or maybe it's the architecture that shows you the tree that helps. I don't know. But it is the case that I think architecture's been thought of as a very mechanical exercise for hospitals. And what Maggie says is perhaps architecture can help healing. Thank you.
I was intrigued to see the pictures of the Edinburgh Maggies, because in the summer I was inquiring after someone I met many years ago, an extremely nice chap who, just maybe a year or two older than me, who developed myeloma. I asked her how the family's getting on, and she said that they're doing fine thanks to Maggie's. So I think it just goes to show how important Maggie's is in people whose lives have been affected by cancer. Anyway, I'm delighted to say that Piers has agreed to answer any questions that anyone may have, but I'm going to ask the first. Are any of them listed?
No. You have to be 30 years old to be listed, unless you're listed at grade 1 or grade 2 star. And really, listings are a bit, have a certain kind of political edge, because fundamentally you list something if it's threatened. Right. Maggies are not threatened. Maggies are not 30 years old, and Maggies have won a Sterling Prize, which is a sort of future listing, as it were. If you get a Sterling Prize, I imagine you're going to get listed in the statutory period. So, but I don't think they need listing. Okay. I don't think anyone's thinking of demolishing or butchering or doing anything horrible to them.
They're all more than worthy of being listed. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Mike.
All right. I declare an interest. I'm a retired oncologist.
Yes.
Can I ask you, how do architects solve the dilemma between security of the building and thieving from the building? Yes. So our Maggies,
yes.
Your Maggies, so ours in general sense, has been stolen from twice,
Yes.
and all the computers and that sort of thing have been lifted. And so, how do you cope with keeping it open for the patients and for the staff, and secure, because it's not open all the time, secure enough as well?
Yeah. I think, as far as I know, and we have experts here who do know, the break-in was when it was closed, and therefore it's possibly more vulnerable, because you can't really, Maggie's can't afford to have 24-hour security. You know, it's not on. And of course, you want the building to look very open, attractive, and graceful, and not look like a secure environment. But we had to succumb to a roller shutter just to stop people breaking in off the bridge through the door. It's, I suppose, like any unoccupied building where people know that it's going to be unoccupied. If you had a house and everybody knew you were away all the time, I guess you might get broken into. It is a problem, and it's a shame. I doubt that CCTV is going to discourage anybody very much, you know. And so we had to get a bit physical. It just was common sense, I suppose. As an architect, it had never even occurred to me that anyone could be so horrible as to nick from a cancer caring trust. And what's interesting is that it was after it'd been on telly. You know, people are very, very obvious. They see it on telly, they think, oh, we could break in there. So that you might say, keep a low profile, don't appear on television. Don't design an interesting building, or one that's recognizable. So they go around saying, where's that Maggie's? Oh, I don't know. It looks like everything else. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being facetious. But it is obviously the case. And no doubt in hospitals you have some of the same problems of petty thieving, opportunistic thieving if you forget to lock a door. You know, it's shocking, but it happens in universities and all kinds of places.
Did you have feedback from all the previous Maggies before you designed the interior, or did you just do it from scratch and this is how it's going to be?
Maggie's...
Presumably there were teething problems.
Sorry.
The first one.
Yes, Maggie's had a very distinctive brief, which is very, very clear, actually, and might seem quite mechanical in itself. It just told you, we want this room this big, this room this big, this room this big, and this room must be at the center of it because it's the kitchen, and it should seat 8 people, or whatever it was. It was quite straightforward. And what they do is they give you this very bold brief, and they don't really talk to you particularly about the emotional side or your approach to it, because they've done by the time it got to me, they'd done 10, so I could easily go and see them, and I did. And you just go and you react to what you see, and people tell you things that they think about them, and you react to that, and all sorts of influences come in, of course. But what Maggies want is they want each architect to tell a story from their point of view. They want each architect to do something that comes from their heart and their head, rather than Maggie's telling them what to do. So the brief is quite, size-wise and everything, it's quite strict, actually, or quite, well, it has to be fairly strict to be within budget. But in terms of how you interpret it, it's absolutely up to you. But they do interrogate you. We do have meetings between the time they ask you and the time they build it. You go over it, you know, you go through it. And I had a much more woody sort of hut-like thing. And then they said, no, Piers, you're all about colours and tiles and brightness. Come on, you know, give us a bit of that. So I introduced the sort of the colour of the building at that stage. I was sort of G'd up to do it.
And have you had feedback about
from
the users?
But actually, in truth, only from a very few, because I've only visited, I think, twice since it was open, since the opening day. So I've only had 2 feedbacks from meeting by chance people who happened to be there at the time I was there. I haven't courted a feedback, and I take my knowledge is entirely from Maggie's themselves, what they feel about it. Yeah, that they've told me.
You mentioned the complexity of modern large hospitals. Is there any way that you can apply the kind of ethos and approach that you've adopted with Maggie centres to larger institutions? And are there any examples of that?
Yes, I think there are examples in the Scandinavian countries. There are some very, very beautiful hospitals built now where you find, instead of plastic, you find materials that you actually like, which are probably tested for hygiene, to the nth degree, and furnishings that you would like to take home, probably. Oh, whoops! That's the other story. That's the other question, wasn't it? Really delicious armchairs and so on, where people feel that there's gracefulness in the design, and they don't seem to have given up on that. Particularly in, as I say, in Scandinavian countries, particularly, they still go for the emotional impact of a place as much as its mechanical necessity. I think it goes right back to Alto and the early modernists, which they were very keen on. And they did very beautiful sort of sanatoria type hospitals, let's call them, in often beautiful surroundings because of the fabulous landscape of that country or those countries. So there are examples still built that aren't on the sort of what I would call what we've now inherited, which is a sort of American approach to health buildings, which is sort of retail mall becomes hospital. It's almost like that now. Sort of fairly economic to the point of well, let's just call it economic attitude, which is design, build, Bouygues or one of these big contractors builds it for you, and they just look for cost cutting everywhere, and it's not a very nice experience. When you sit down on a chair and it goes, when you stand up, it's not very nice. So yes, there are examples. I live very near enough to Whitechapel, to the London Hospital, to be a patient of the London Hospital, and it is infinite. I'm afraid I find it infinitely depressing. In your world, it may be the cutting edge of marvelousness, and the doctors that I've had surgeons been absolutely, completely brilliant and wonderful people, and in every way do everything right, and fantastic support staff, and so on, and great physio, and all that. But the place, I mean, your heart just sinks. You just walk right from the entrance hall. Your heart just goes, oh, for God's sake. Yeah. So I'm sorry, but I think there is a way, and it's probably the contractual way which we secure hospitals here with our very Americanized, kind of privatized way of selling off all problems to the private sector, who then come in and do something efficient but not graceful.
Can I ask you, are there any plans for the future of this Maggie's? For example, can you have the grounds landscaped?
For this one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we did. There is a landscape, swirls around the underside of our Maggie's.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. It may have been a bit too new to have really sprouted up when you saw it, but there is some landscaping. I have a landscape architect in my office, so he did the landscape for us. Again, fairly economically. I mean, we were pretty determined not to gild the lily, as it were. Oh, that's a bad joke, because Charles' daughter, who's the landscape architect, is called Lily. So perhaps that was, yeah, forget that. I forgot I ever said that. Because she's a wonderful landscape architect, and probably, did marvels on a shoestring, but yeah.
Piers, how closely is Charles Jenks himself involved in the process of commissioning, design, etc., of all of the Maggie centres? And does he keep a continued interest and involvement?
Yeah, I think you can almost guess that he is fascinated by the process. He loves the architects that get commissioned. He loves challenging them. He loves arguing with them. He loves telling them what they've done. Oh, your design's a typical broken spiral. And they all go, really? But he's very much engaged, and he is, I would say he's the one that keeps the architects on their toes, and he doesn't just call, he visits your office with others, with Laura, for instance. They kind of come in a gang and descend on you, and it's great fun, and you have a great morning together and discuss it. So, yes, he's very much engaged and incredibly appreciative, of course. He writes beautifully about what you've done. He sort of explains yourself to yourself, which is very nice. He gets under your skin and tells you what you've done. And that's, of course, the most flattering thing that can happen to an architect is a review, as it were, that makes the effort to understand you and to tell you, your faults and your better aspects. It's good for you. Yeah. So Charlie's very involved in choosing the architects and very involved in as it were, challenging them to do a really good building.
Okay. I'd like to invite Mr. Ray Sylvester to give the vote of thanks.
I feel very privileged, honoured that Jeff's asked me to deliver the vote of thanks. I'll come over here a bit closer. I think probably I may well be uniquely qualified to deliver this vote of thanks, because over the past few years... Oh, yeah, it's also National Cancer Day, of course. Did you know that, Jeff? I thought you'd organised it that way.
Wow.
Yeah, and apparently 1 in 2 of us,
I know
the
now,
new figures, are going to get cancer.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, I've had it twice. Who's did I have the second time? I want to know who he or she is, because
I hope it's me.
I feel a bit bitter about it. Now, I am, I think, uniquely qualified to deliver this vote of thanks. I have had 2 lots. One before Maggie's and the other after Maggie's. Let me tell you very quickly. I had the first news in a department, I won't name the department, and you've got cancer, and if you come back next week, we'll tell you more about it, we'll give you a more definitive diagnosis. Thank you, just make an appointment outside. And Kath and I wandered out, and we looked at each other. I'd just been told that what I thought was a sentence of death. What do we do now? And Kath said, what about you? She said, I'm going shopping in Sainsbury's. So we went off to Sainsbury's and Arnold, and Kathy parked me in the cafe there. Well, when I did the shopping, life goes on, and I sat there feeling very, very, very sorry for myself.
Yeah.
Anyway, how many years later it was, I was delivered another diagnosis by one of the kind people up here or in the hospital. And actually, after I was given the diagnosis, I did have a session with a nurse practitioner, but she was very very organised, very methodical, very professional, and absolutely threw an enormous amount of information at us, didn't she, Gav? None of it was really no. So we went down to Maggie's, which by that time had been opened, I think, about a year, and it was just a totally different atmosphere, and I sat down, I spoke to the manager of the place, she showed me around, she showed me the literature, and it was just a much, much more relaxing, positive experience than going to Sainsbury's.
Wow, that's the endorsement of all endorsements.
Yes, so somebody here asked about feedback.
Yep.
I'm giving you feedback.
Gosh.
I think your building is wonderful, and as a user, just creates the right atmosphere and the right feel for somebody who, as you know, has had a terrible bit of news and wants to talk about it and relax and get their head around it. So Thank you very much indeed
Oh, thank
for
you.
your
That's
contribution
very sweet of you.
to
Thank
the whole
you.
project.
Thank you, Rog.